The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Montana plains, driving sheets of snow against the weathered boards of the ranch house. Ruth Morrison stood at the frost-covered window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the storm devour the last traces of daylight. Another winter, another season of isolation stretching before her like an endless white shroud. She turned from the window, her boots clicking against the worn floorboards. The house felt too large, too empty, despite being modest by any standard. Just 4 rooms and a loft, built by her late husband's hands 5 years prior. Samuel had been gone 3 months now, buried on the hill behind the house where the aspens grew thick in summer. A riding accident. She told anyone who asked. The horse had spooked. He'd fallen badly. These things happened in the territory. The people in town whispered different stories when they thought she couldn't hear. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter and moved to the hearth, adding another log to the dying fire. Her hands, once soft from a childhood in St. Louis, were now rough and capable, marked by calluses and small scars. 28 years old and already a widow. Already alone in a land that seemed determined to swallow the weak whole. She'd grown accustomed to the solitude. The nearest neighbor, the Garrett family, lived 4 miles east, and with the storms settling in, she might not see another soul until spring. The larder was well stocked, smoked venison, preserved vegetables from her summer garden, sacks of flour and beans. The woodshed held enough split pine and cedar to last until April. She'd learned to prepare, to survive. The storm intensified as full darkness fell. Ruth lit the oil lamp and settled into her chair with a cup of bitter coffee, trying to focus on the mending in her lap, but her fingers stilled as memories crept in unbidden. Samuel's last night, the argument, the way his face had twisted with rage when she'd confronted him about the woman in town, that saloon girl with the painted lips and knowing eyes. She shook her head sharply, forcing the thoughts away. The past was buried with Samuel on that hill. It had to be. The first sound came just after 9 o'clock, a faint noise almost lost in the storm's fury. Ruth's head snapped up, needle poised in mid-air. She knew every sound this house made, every creak and groan of settling timber. This was different. This was there, again, a rhythmic thumping against wood. Her heart began to race. No one traveled in weather like this, no one with sense. Anyway, she set aside her mending and moved quietly to the window, peering out into the swirling white. Nothing but snow and darkness. The sound came once more. Clearly now, someone pounding on the door. Ruth's hand went instinctively to the shotgun mounted above the hearth. Samuel's Winchester. She'd cleaned it just last week, the way he'd taught her. Her fingers hesitated on the cold metal. Whoever was out there would die in this storm, but letting a stranger into her home, alone, miles from help. The pounding grew weaker. "Lord help me," she whispered, taking down the rifle. She approached the door slowly, weapon ready. "Who's there?" she called out, voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. No answer, just another feeble knock. Ruth drew back the heavy bolt and cracked the door open. Wind and snow burst through the gap, nearly tearing it from her grip. A figure slumped against the doorframe. A man, covered in snow. One hand pressed against his side. Even in the dim light spilling from behind her, she could see the dark stain spreading between his fingers. "Please," he gasped, and then his knees buckled. She caught him instinctively, dropping the rifle to grab his shoulders. He was tall, lean, his weight driving her back a step. The smell hit her then, whiskey, blood, and something else. Fear, desperation. "Get inside," she grunted, half dragging him across the threshold. She kicked the door shut and lowered him to the floor, her mind racing. His coat was torn, the fabric around his ribs soaked with blood. A knife wound, maybe, or she'd seen enough hunting accidents to recognize a bullet hole. The stranger's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with difficulty. They were gray as the storm outside, lined with pain. "Sorry," he mumbled. Didn't know anyone." "Hush," Ruth said automatically, her hands already moving to assess the damage. The wound was on his left side, still bleeding but not pumping. That was good. Maybe she needed to make a decision. The man was clearly running from something, or someone. Honest folk didn't ride through blizzards with bullet holes in their sides. But looking at him now, shivering on her floor, snow melting into puddles around him, she saw only another human being in pain. "Can you walk?" she asked. He tried to push himself up, face contorting. Maybe. There's an old barn out back. Empty now, but it's got walls and a roof." She helped him sit up, trying not to notice how his hand clutched at her arm. "I'll see to that wound, but that's all. Come morning, storm willing. You move on. Understood?" He nodded weakly. "Understood. And thank you." Ruth retrieved the rifle and helped him to his feet. Together they stumbled through the house to the back door, then out into the screaming wind. The barn stood 20 yards away, a dark hulk barely visible through the snow. By the time they reached it, both were gasping, covered in white. She lit the lantern she kept hanging by the door, revealing the empty stalls and scattered hay. At least it was dry, and the walls cut the wind. She helped him down onto a pile of old horse blankets in the corner. "I'll be back," she said, already turning to go. His hand caught her sleeve. "Why?" he asked, teeth chattering. "Why help me?" Ruth looked down at him, this stranger who'd brought danger to her doorstep. "Because I'm not an animal," she said simply, and pulled free. Back in the house, she gathered what she needed. Clean rags, the bottle of whiskey from Samuel's hiding place, a needle and thread, blankets. Her hands moved without conscious thought, falling into the rhythms of tending the sick that she'd learned as a girl. Watching her mother, the barn felt colder when she returned. The stranger, she realized she didn't even know his name, had managed to remove his coat and shirt, revealing a lean torso marked by more than just the current wound. Scars crisscrossed his skin, telling stories of violence she didn't want to know. "This'll hurt," she warned, kneeling beside him. "Can't hurt worse than—" He broke off with a hiss as she poured whiskey over the wound. The bullet had passed through. Thank God. No digging required. She worked in silence, cleaning and stitching while he bit down on a piece of leather to muffle his groans. Her hands remained steady, but her mind churned. Who was this man? What was he running from? And what had she just invited into her life? When she finished, he was barely conscious, skin gray beneath its tan. She covered him with the blankets, built up a small fire in the old forge, carefully, so the smoke wouldn't show too much, and stood to leave. "Name's Eli," he whispered without opening his eyes. "Eli Caldwell. In case I don't wake up." "You'll wake up," Ruth said firmly. "And then you'll leave." She returned to the house and barred the door behind her. Sleep would not come tonight, she knew. She sat by the window instead, rifle across her lap, watching the barn and listening to the storm. The coffee grew cold in her cup. The mending lay forgotten. Memories of another night pressed close, Samuel's voice slurring with drink, his hands rough and demanding, the sound of his body hitting the ground, the horse's frightened whinny. How long she'd waited before going to him, before raising the alarm. Ruth closed her eyes, but the images remained. She'd made her choice that night, just as she'd made one tonight. The difference was, this time she'd chosen mercy. Outside, the blizzard raged on, burying the world in white. Come morning, there would be decisions to make. But for now, she sat her vigil, caught between the past that haunted her and the stranger bleeding in her barn, wondering which would prove more dangerous. The wind screamed across the empty plains, and Ruth Morrison kept watch through the long, cold night. Dawn came slowly, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the early hours. Ruth woke stiff in her chair, the rifle still heavy across her lap. For a moment, she couldn't remember why she'd slept sitting up. Then it all rushed back. The stranger, the blood, the choice she'd made in the darkness. She rose quietly, joints protesting, and peered out the window. The barn stood silent under a fresh blanket of snow. No smoke rose from the makeshift chimney. Her heart tightened. Had he died in the night? The thought brought an unexpected pang, not of grief exactly, but something close to it. Ruth pulled on her heavy coat and boots, then made her way through the knee-deep drifts to the barn. The door creaked as she pushed it open, letting in a shaft of pale morning light. The stranger, Eli, she reminded herself, lay exactly where she'd left him. So still she feared the worst, but as she approached, she saw the slight rise and fall of his chest beneath the blankets. His face was flushed, skin hot to the touch, fever. She'd expected as much. Infection was always a risk with wounds like his. "Water," he mumbled without opening his eyes. Ruth fetched snow in a bucket, letting it melt by the dying embers of the forge fire. She helped him drink, supporting his head with one hand. This close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble. Handsome, in a rough way, the kind of man who'd turned many a foolish girl's head. "You need to be in a proper bed," she heard herself saying. "The fever will kill you out here." His eyes opened then, focusing on her with effort. "Can't impose." "You already have," Ruth said curtly. "Question is whether I let you die for it." She made her decision quickly, before good sense could intervene. It took considerable effort to get him on his feet and across the yard to the house. He leaned heavily on her, breath coming in short gasps, the wound seeping fresh blood through the bandages. By the time they reached the spare room, Samuel's office, really, with its narrow cot and shelves of ledgers, both were exhausted. Eli collapsed onto the cot with a groan. Ruth stood catching her breath, already second-guessing herself. A strange man in her house. What would people say if they knew? Then again, people already said plenty about the widow Morrison. She spent the next hour making him as comfortable as possible. Fresh bandages, more water, a dose of laudanum from the precious bottle she kept for emergencies. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling words she couldn't make out. Once, "Clear as day," he said. "Martha, I'm sorry." A wife? A sister? Ruth found herself curious despite her better judgment. The day passed in a blur of caretaking. She made broth from the venison bones she'd been saving, spooning it between his lips when he could manage, changed his bandages, kept the fire going. All the while, the house felt different with him in it, charged somehow, like the air before lightning strikes. That evening, his fever broke. Ruth was adjusting his blankets when his hand suddenly caught hers. Grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you," he said, voice rough but clear. She pulled her hand away. "Don't thank me yet. You're not out of danger." Still. He studied her face in the lamplight. Not many would take in a stranger, especially one who showed up bleeding. "Yes, well." Ruth busied herself gathering the used bandages. "I have my reasons." "What reasons?" She met his gaze squarely. "My own." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "Fair enough." They lapsed into silence. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows. Ruth knew she should leave, return to her own room. But something held her there. "You talked in your fever," she said finally. "Called for someone named Martha." The smile vanished. He turned his face toward the wall. "Did I—" "Your wife? She died 2 years back." "I'm sorry." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Everybody's sorry. Doesn't bring her back." Ruth understood that bitterness. She'd heard enough condolences after Samuel's death to last a lifetime. Empty words that changed nothing. "How?" she asked, then caught herself. "I apologize. That's not my business." "Cholera," he said anyway. "Took her and our boy both. I was away, working a cattle drive. Came home to Graves." The raw pain in his voice made her chest tight. She thought of the child she'd lost early in her marriage, the tiny grave under the apple tree. Some hurts never healed, just scarred over. "Is that why you—" She gestured vaguely at his wound. "Why I'm running?" He turned back to her, expression guarded now. "That's a different story. One you're better off not knowing. I'm already harboring you. Seems I have a right to know what trouble I'm courting." He considered this. There was a card game. "Up in Billings, man accused me of cheating." "Were you?" "No." His jaw tightened. "But he was the mayor's son. His word against mine. When I tried to leave, he pulled a gun. I was faster. You killed him? Winged him. But that was enough. His father put a bounty on my head. Been running 3 weeks now." Ruth absorbed this information. She should be frightened, she supposed. Should order him out immediately. Instead, she felt only a tired kind of understanding. The world was full of men who thought their names and positions gave them the right to take what they wanted. Truth be damned. "You planning to bring that trouble to my door?" she asked. "No, ma'am. Soon as I can ride, I'll be gone. Canada, maybe. Start over where nobody knows my name." She nodded slowly. "See that you do." Rising to leave, she paused at the doorway. "My husband's clothes should fit you well enough. I'll bring some in the morning." "I don't—" He stopped, seeming to realize arguing would be pointless. "Thank you." Again. Ruth didn't answer, just pulled the door closed behind her. That night, she lay in her own bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in the house, the occasional cough, the creak of the cot as he shifted. It had been months since she'd shared these walls with anyone, and the presence of it, even a stranger's presence, stirred things in her she'd thought frozen. She thought of his hands, scarred but gentle, the way grief had softened his voice when he spoke of his family. Dangerous thoughts for a woman in her position. She'd do well to remember he was leaving as soon as he was able. The next days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Ruth would tend his wound, bring meals, sit sometimes and talk while he ate. He was an easy patient, grateful without being obsequious, quiet without being sullen. They spoke carefully around the edges of their lives. She learned he'd grown up in Tennessee, had fought in the war, had tried his hand at everything from mining to cattle driving. He learned she could read and write, unusual for a ranch woman, that she'd grown up in St. Louis before her father's gambling debts drove them west. Neither spoke of their marriages again. That ground felt too dangerous to tread. By the 4th day, he was able to move about the room, though she forbade him from venturing further. "Last thing we need is you tearing those stitches," she said firmly. "Yes, ma'am." He replied with mock solemnity that almost made her smile. On the 5th night, she found him standing by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. He'd pulled on the shirt and trousers she'd brought him, Samuel's clothes, though she hadn't said so. They fit well enough, though he was leaner than her husband had been. "Cabin fever?" she asked from the doorway. He turned, offering a rueful smile. "Something like that. Been a long time since I stayed in one place this long." "The wandering life suits you?" "Didn't used to. Had a little farm once, nothing grand, but it was mine, ours." His expression darkened. "Amazing how quick a life can disappear. One day you're planting next year's crops, the next you're burying everything that mattered." Ruth moved into the room, drawn despite herself. "So you run, so I run." He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. "What about you? You're not running, but you're sure as hell hiding." "I'm surviving," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" The question hung between them, uncomfortable in its accuracy. Before she could answer, he swayed slightly, hand going to his side. "You're overdoing it," she said, moving instinctively to steady him. "I'm fine." "You're not." She guided him back to the cot, trying to ignore how natural it felt to have his weight against her. "You lost a lot of blood. It takes time to build it back up." He sat heavily, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Why are you doing this? Really?" Ruth stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. "I told you." "You have your reasons." "Yes, but I've given you plenty of cause to throw me out." "Why haven't you?" She was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone," she said finally. "Maybe even a wounded stranger is better than another winter of talking to the walls." It was more honesty than she'd intended. His expression softened. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. They stayed there, the space between them charged with understanding and something else, something neither was ready to name. Then Ruth straightened, rebuilding her walls with practiced efficiency. "Rest," she ordered. "I'll bring supper in an hour." She left before he could respond, before the moment could become something more than it was. But she felt his eyes on her all the way to the door, and the weight of that gaze followed her through the empty house like a promise she wasn't sure she wanted kept. The morning Ruth decided to go to town. The sky was clear for the first time in over a week. She stood in the doorway of the spare room, watching Eli test his strength by walking slowly from wall to wall. "I need supplies," she announced. "Medicine, mainly. That wound's healing, but slowly." He paused mid-step, turning to face her. "That's not wise. People will ask questions. People always ask questions." She pulled on her gloves with sharp, decisive movements. "I've been managing them for months now. It's different now. If someone's tracking me—" "Are they?" He held her gaze. "I don't know. Maybe." Ruth considered this, then shrugged. "I'll be careful. Keep the doors barred and stay away from the windows. I should be back before dark." Ruth, the use of her name stopped her at the threshold. He'd been careful about that, maintaining the formal distance of ma'am until now. "Be careful, please." Something in his voice made her throat tight. She nodded without turning around and left before either of them could say more. The ride to town took 3 hours through the snow-packed trails. Ruth's horse, a steady mare named Buttercup, picked her way carefully through the drifts. The cold bit at Ruth's cheeks above her scarf, but the sun felt good after so many gray days. The town of Cedar Ridge wasn't much. One main street, a handful of shops, 2 saloons, and a church that doubled as the schoolhouse. But it was civilization, such as it was, and Ruth always felt both relief and dread when its buildings came into view. She hitched Buttercup outside Morrison's general store, no relation to her late husband, despite the name, and steeled herself for what was to come. The bell above the door announced her arrival. 3 women stood near the fabric counter, their conversation dying the moment they saw her. Ruth recognized them. Mrs. Garrett, whose husband owned the neighboring ranch, Mrs. Palmer, the banker's wife, and young Lucy Donnell, who worked at the boarding house, Mrs. Morrison. "Mrs. Garrett said, her tone carefully neutral. "We haven't seen you in town for some time." "I've been managing," Ruth replied, moving toward the counter where Mr. Morrison stood watching. "The storms kept me home." "Of course." Mrs. Palmer's smile was thin as paper. "Though one wonders how you manage all alone out there, such a large property for a woman to handle by herself. I manage well enough." "Still," Mrs. Garrett pressed, "it must be lonely. Perhaps you should consider selling. My husband mentioned he'd make you a fair offer." Ruth had heard this before. Fair offer. As if they didn't all know the ranch had the best water rights in the valley, that Samuel had built it up through sweat and savvy dealing. They thought a widow couldn't hold on to it. They were waiting for her to fail. "I'm not interested in selling," she said firmly, turning to Mr. Morrison. "I need laudanum, if you have any, and carbolic acid." His bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "Someone heard out your way? Cut my hand badly." Ruth lied smoothly, holding up her gloved hand. "Want to keep it clean?" He nodded slowly, but she could see the doubt in his eyes as he gathered her items. The women behind her had resumed their whispered conversation, and Ruth caught fragments. Always was odd. Poor Samuel. Unnatural, living alone like that. Lucy Donnell separated from the group, approaching Ruth with something like sympathy in her young face. "Mrs. Morrison," she said quietly, "I wanted to say, I'm sorry for your loss. Mr. Morrison was always kind to me." Ruth's jaw tightened. Samuel had been many things, but kind wasn't one of them. She'd seen him looking at Lucy, at all the young women in town, but she merely nodded. "Thank you." Lucy leaned closer, lowering her voice further. "There was a man came through yesterday. Rough-looking fellow. Badge said he was a deputy from Billings. Asked a lot of questions about strangers passing through." Ruth's heart hammered, but she kept her face calm. "Is that so? Mentioned a reward, $500. Lucy's eyes searched hers. "That's a lot of money for folks around here. Makes people remember things they might otherwise forget." "I suppose it does," Ruth agreed carefully. Lucy glanced at the other women, then back at Ruth. "You take care of yourself out there. And that cut hand." She moved away before Ruth could respond, rejoining the gossip circle. Ruth paid for her purchases, aware of every eye in the store following her movements. Mr. Morrison wrapped her items slowly, as if waiting for her to offer more information. She didn't. Outside, she took a deep breath of cold air, trying to calm her racing thoughts. A deputy asking questions. A reward. How long before someone put together Eli's arrival with her sudden need for medical supplies? She stopped at the feed store for grain, enduring more stares and whispers. The blacksmith, at least, only nodded when she picked up the horseshoe nails she'd ordered weeks ago. But even his silence felt weighted with judgment. The sun was already past its zenith when she finally turned Buttercup toward home. The ride back seemed longer, every shadow potentially hiding someone watching, waiting. Twice she stopped, certain she heard hoofbeats behind her, but the trail remained empty. She was a mile from home when she saw the tracks, fresh horse prints crossing her path, leading toward her property. Her mouth went dry. She urged Buttercup into a faster pace, one hand moving to the rifle in her saddle scabbard. The house came into view, looking undisturbed. No strange horses, no sign of trouble. But the tracks led right to her gate before turning back toward town. Someone had come calling while she was away. Ruth dismounted quickly, leading Buttercup into the barn. Her hands shook as she unsaddled the mare. When she entered the house, she found Eli standing in the kitchen, Samuel's pistol in his hand. "It's me," she said quickly. He lowered the gun, tension draining from his shoulders. "Someone came, about an hour ago, knocked for a good while before giving up. I saw the tracks." She set her purchases on the table, pulling off her gloves. "There's a deputy in town, from Billings." His face went carefully blank. "I see. $500 reward." She unpacked the medicines, not looking at him. "That's enough to tempt anyone around here. Times are hard." "I'll leave tonight." "You'll tear your stitches and bleed to death in the snow." She finally met his eyes. "That what you want? Better than bringing trouble to your door?" Ruth laughed, a bitter sound. "Trouble was at my door long before you showed up." She told him then about the store, the women, their thinly veiled contempt, the offers to buy her out, the whispers about Samuel's death that never quite died. As she spoke, she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "They think you killed him," he said quietly. "Don't they just—" She sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "A woman alone, a husband dead in mysterious circumstances. Story writes itself." "Did you?" The question should have offended her. Instead, she found his directness refreshing. "No, but I wanted to. Does that shock you?" "No." He sat across from her, movements careful of his wound. "I've known plenty of men who deserved killing. Some of them were husbands." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Ruth rose, busying herself with preparing supper. "The deputy will move on in a day or two. These types always do when the trail goes cold. You stay put until then." "Ruth, that's the end of it." She kept her back to him, focusing on the simple task of peeling potatoes. "I didn't save your life just to have you throw it away on some fool notion of protecting my reputation. That ship sailed long ago." She heard him stand, heard his footsteps crossing the floor. He stopped just behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You're a remarkable woman, Ruth Morrison." His voice was low, intimate. She closed her eyes, fighting the urge to lean back into him. "I'm a practical woman. There's a difference." "Is there?" He echoed his own question from days before. She turned then, finding him closer than expected. His eyes were dark in the fading light, focused on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't what? Don't look at me like that, like I'm something more than I am." His hand rose, hovering near her cheek without quite touching. "What if you are?" The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Then hoofbeats sounded in the yard, and they sprang apart. Ruth grabbed the rifle while Eli pressed himself against the wall, out of sight from the windows. "Mrs. Morrison," a man's voice called. "Mrs. Morrison, you in there?" Ruth recognized the voice. Tom Garrett, her neighbor. She lowered the rifle but didn't put it away. "What do you want, Tom?" "Just checking on you. Ma'am, saw you in town today. Wanted to make sure you made it home safe. And wanted to nose around. More likely." Ruth moved to the door but didn't open it. "I'm fine. Tom, thank you for your concern. Thing is, there's been some trouble. That deputy from Billings, he's saying there might be a dangerous man in the area. Wounded. You haven't seen anyone, have you?" Ruth's grip tightened on the rifle. "No one but you, Tom." A pause. "You sure about that? Because if someone was threatening you, making you lie—" "Good night, Tom." Her voice was steel. "Give my regards to Helen." Another pause. Longer. Then, "You take care, Mrs. Morrison. And remember, my offer stands. The ranch. I mean, whenever you're ready." She listened to him right away, not moving until the hoofbeats faded completely. When she turned, Eli was watching her with an unreadable expression. "They won't give up," he said. "Not the deputy, not your neighbors. They smell blood in the water." "Let them smell." She set the rifle aside with deliberate calm. "I've faced worse than gossip and greedy neighbors." But as she returned to making supper, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The storm outside had passed, but another was brewing, one that threatened to sweep away everything she'd built in the ruins of her marriage. She glanced at Eli, who had returned to his chair, and wondered which would prove her undoing first, the danger he'd brought to her door, or the way her heart raced when he looked at her. Either way, she suspected her quiet winter was over. The wolf howls started just after midnight, piercing the darkness with their primal call. Ruth jerked awake in her chair by the fireplace, the book she'd been reading tumbling to the floor. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by answering cries from multiple directions. She'd heard wolves before, but never this close to the house, never in such numbers. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Eli appeared in the doorway, fully dressed despite the late hour. Pain flickered across his face as he moved, but he was steadier on his feet than he'd been even that morning. "How many?" she asked, already knowing he'd been listening too. "Pack of 6, maybe 8. He moved to the window, peering out into the moonlit yard. "Circling wide for now, but they're testing." Ruth stood, wrapping her shawl tighter. "The chickens? Locked up tight." "Yes, but the coop's not built for wolves." She moved to stand beside him, close enough to catch his scent, wool and wood smoke and something distinctly male. They must be desperate to come so close. The storm drove the deer down to the valleys. Another howl split the night, so close the windows seemed to vibrate. Ruth's mare whinnied in terror from the barn. "Buttercup," she breathed, already moving toward the door. Eli caught her arm. "You can't go out there." "I won't lose that horse." She pulled free, grabbing the rifle from its place. "She's all I have to—" "Ruth," his voice was firm but gentle. "I'll go. You can barely walk without wincing. I can walk well enough to shoot." He was already checking Samuel's pistol, movements efficient despite his injury. "You cover me from the porch. If they rush, we'll have better odds with 2 guns." She wanted to argue, but another terrified whinny from Buttercup decided her. "Fine, but if you tear those stitches, you'll sew them again." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. Wouldn't be the first time. They moved together to the door. Ruth's heart hammered as she lifted the bar. The moon was full, casting everything in sharp silver relief. She could see shadows moving at the edge of the property, low and purposeful. "Ready?" Eli asked. She nodded, rifle raised. He slipped out, moving with surprising grace for a wounded man. Ruth followed onto the porch, scanning the yard. The wolves materialized from the darkness, gray ghosts with gleaming eyes. 7 of them, spread in a loose semicircle. The pack leader, a massive male with a scarred muzzle, stepped forward. Even from 30 yards, Ruth could see his ribs showing through matted fur. Desperate indeed. Eli had reached the barn door. The wolves watched him, heads low, waiting. The second he lifted the bar, they'd rush. They both knew it. "On 3, he called back, voice steady. 1. Ruth sighted down the rifle barrel, picking her target. 2. The wolves tensed, muscles coiling. 3. The barn door swung open. Eli dove inside as the pack surged forward. Ruth fired, her shot taking the lead wolf in the shoulder. He yelped and stumbled but didn't go down. Eli's pistol cracked from inside the barn, once, twice. Another wolf spun and fell. The pack hesitated, confused by the loss of their leader. Ruth reloaded with practiced speed, firing again. This time the big male dropped, twitching in the snow. "Move! Move!" Eli shouted. Buttercup burst from the barn, eyes rolling white with terror. Eli had a handful of her mane, using her momentum to help him stay upright as they raced toward the house. The remaining wolves scattered, then regrouped, giving chase. Ruth fired again, forcing them to veer off. Her hands were steady, but her mind raced. 3 shots left, not enough if they decided to press the attack. Eli and Buttercup reached the porch. He slapped the mare's rump, sending her around to the lee side of the house, then stumbled up the steps. Ruth grabbed his arm, hauling him inside. She slammed the door and dropped the bar just as bodies thudded against the wood. They stood gasping in the darkness, listening to the frustrated snarls outside. Claws scraped against the door. "Testing. Your side," Ruth said, reaching for him. "It's fine." But he let her check, lifting his shirt to reveal the bandages. A small spot of red had seeped through, but the stitches held. Her hands lingered on the warm skin of his ribs. She felt his breath catch, felt her own do the same. The danger outside suddenly seemed less immediate than the heat building between them. "Ruth," he said softly. She pulled back, wrapping her arms around herself. "We should check the windows, make sure they can't—" A crash from the kitchen cut her off. They rushed in to find a wolf halfway through the window. Glass scattered across the floor. Its jaws snapped wildly as it tried to force its lean body through the frame. Eli didn't hesitate. 2 shots and the wolf went limp, hanging half in, half out of the window like some macabre trophy. "Board," Ruth said, already moving. In the pantry, they worked together to secure the window, then checked every other potential entry point. The remaining wolves circled the house, their howls taking on a frustrated edge. But as the hours wore on, the sounds grew more distant. "They're giving up," Eli said finally. They stood in the kitchen, both exhausted, watching the first hints of dawn creep across the sky. For now. Ruth sank into a chair, the rifle still across her lap. "They'll be back, or others will. Once they know there's prey here, then we'll be ready." She looked at him, really looked. His face was drawn with pain and fatigue, but his eyes were steady, determined, protective. When had this stranger become we? "You should rest," she said. "I'll keep watch. I'm not leaving you alone, not after that." "Eli, what did your husband do?" The question came abruptly, his gaze intense. "When the wolves came, when trouble showed up at the door." Ruth's jaw tightened. "Samuel didn't believe in women handling guns. Said it wasn't proper, wasn't feminine. But you learned anyway. My father taught me, back in St. Louis, before he lost everything." She traced the rifle's stock with one finger. "Samuel hated it. Hated anything that suggested I didn't need him. Did you need him?" The question hung in the air. Ruth considered her words carefully. I was 20 when we married. He was 35, successful, established. My parents thought it was a good match. Saved me from their failures." She laughed bitterly. "Instead, I traded one kind of prison for another." Eli moved closer, leaning against the table. "Prison's a harsh word." "Is it?" She met his gaze defiantly. "He controlled every aspect of my life. Who I could speak to, where I could go, how I could dress, made sure everyone in town knew I was his property, and when I disappointed him." She trailed off, old shame rising. "He hurt you?" It wasn't a question. Ruth nodded once, sharply, never where it would show. He was careful about that, had a reputation to maintain. Eli's hands clenched into fists. "The night he died?" "We argued. I'd found out about the girl in town. Wasn't the first time, but something in me just broke. I told him I was leaving." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He said he'd kill me first. Said he'd make it look like an accident. That everyone would believe him because who was I? Just his difficult wife." "So you killed him?" "No." Ruth lifted her chin. "I told you the truth. I didn't kill him. But when he stormed out to the barn, drunk and raging, when I heard the horse scream and the crash," she closed her eyes. "I waited, sat right here at this table and waited a full 10 minutes before I went out. By then, it was too late." "He was already dead?" "No, but close. The horse had thrown him into the stall partition, cracked his skull." She opened her eyes, meeting Eli's without flinching. "He asked me to help him, begged, and I stood there and watched him die." Silence stretched between them. Ruth waited for the judgment, the disgust. Instead, Eli reached out and covered her hand with his. "Good," he said simply. The word unlocked something in her chest. Tears she hadn't shed in months suddenly threatened. "The whole town thinks I murdered him." "Let them think it." His thumb stroked across her knuckles. "You survived. That's what matters." "Is it?" She turned her hand palm up, lacing her fingers through his. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm just going through the motions, existing instead of living. I know that feeling." His grip tightened. "After Martha died, after I buried our son, I wanted to follow them. Nearly did, more than once. But the body keeps going even when the soul wants to quit. You wake up, you eat, you work, and eventually you realize you're still alive despite yourself. When does it stop hurting?" "I don't know." He lifted their joined hands, studying them. "But I think maybe it hurts less when you're not alone with it." Ruth's breath caught. The air between them crackled with possibility, with the promise of something neither had thought to find again. She leaned forward, drawn by invisible threads. "Eli," she whispered. He cupped her face with his free hand, thumb brushing her cheek. "Tell me to stop." "I can't. Tell me this is wrong." "I can't do that either." He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met softly at first, tentative as if testing whether such sweetness was still possible in their harsh world. Then Ruth made a small sound in her throat, and restraint shattered. The kiss deepened, became desperate. All the loneliness, the fear, the need poured out between them. Ruth's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer. He groaned against her mouth, the sound sending heat spiraling through her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Eli rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "This complicates things," he said roughly. "Everything's already complicated." She traced the line of his jaw, marveling at the freedom to touch. "What's one more impossible thing?" He caught her hand, pressing it flat against his chest where his heart raced. "I have to leave. Ruth, the deputy, the reward." "I can't stay." "I know, but I don't want to. God help me, I don't want to leave you." The confession hung between them, precious and painful. Ruth closed her eyes, memorizing the feel of his heartbeat under her palm. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the night's terrors. But inside the small kitchen, two damaged souls clung to each other, finding in their shared brokenness something that felt almost like being whole. The decision came without words as another storm rolled in that evening, bringing with it a bitter cold that seeped through every crack in the walls. Ruth had been tending the fire when the first winds hit, rattling the windows with renewed fury. She looked up to find Eli standing in the doorway, a question in his storm-gray eyes. "The spare room's freezing," he said simply. "Fire won't catch in there. Chimney must be blocked." It was probably true. Maybe. Ruth didn't ask for details. The cold was excuse enough for what they both wanted, but couldn't voice in daylight. "You can't sleep in a cold room with that wound," she heard herself say. "Not if you want it to heal properly." They prepared for bed with exaggerated normalcy, moving around each other in careful choreography. Ruth banked the fire in the main room while Eli checked the doors and windows one last time. When she retreated to her bedroom to change into her nightgown, her hands trembled on the buttons. She'd shared this bed with Samuel for 6 years, but those nights had been about duty, about enduring. This was something else entirely. This was want, need, choice. When she emerged, Eli was standing by the window, silhouetted against the snow-streaked glass. He'd removed his shirt, and the bandages stood out white against his skin. He turned at her approach, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "Ruth," he said, her name a question and a prayer. She crossed to him, bare feet silent on the cold floor. "You're shivering. Not from cold." She reached up, fingertips tracing the edges of his bandage. "Does it hurt?" "Everything hurts." He caught her hand, pressing it flat against his chest. "But not this. This doesn't hurt." The first touch of their lips was soft, almost reverent, but the gentleness couldn't last, not with weeks of tension coiled between them. Ruth made a sound deep in her throat, and Eli responded, pulling her against him with sudden urgency. His hands tangled in her hair, loosening the pins she'd forgotten to remove. She pressed closer, marveling at the solid warmth of him, at the way her body remembered pleasures she'd thought forever tainted by bad memories. They moved toward the bed without breaking contact, stumbling slightly in the darkness. Eli's hands shook as they found the ties of her nightgown. "Tell me if—" "Don't stop," she whispered against his mouth. "Please don't stop." What followed was nothing like her experiences with Samuel. Where he had taken. Eli asked. Where he had demanded. Eli offered. Each touch was a question. Each kiss an invitation she eagerly accepted. When he hesitated at a scar on her ribs, one of Samuel's gifts, she guided his hand back. "Old wounds," she said. "They don't matter now." He kissed the mark tenderly, then found others, honoring each hurt with gentle attention until Ruth thought she might weep from the sweetness of it. Their joining, when it came, was both fierce and tender. Ruth bit her lip to keep from crying out, overwhelmed by sensations she'd never expected to feel. Eli moved with careful attention to her responses, learning her as if she were a new language he was desperate to speak fluently. Afterward, they lay entwined, Ruth's head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. The storm raged outside, but the room felt like a sanctuary. She traced idle patterns on his skin, marveling at the freedom to touch, to explore. "I never—" she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice it. "Never what?" His hand stroked through her unbound hair. "Never felt like this, never knew it could be." She lifted her head to look at him. "Samuel said I was cold, unnatural, that a proper woman didn't—" Eli's arms tightened around her. "Samuel was a fool." "Was he?" Old doubts crept in. "Maybe I am wanted. Maybe the town gossips are right about me." He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known. You survived a man who tried to break you. You run a ranch alone. You saved a stranger's life." His thumb brushed her cheek. "If that makes you improper, then thank God for improper women." Fresh tears threatened. Ruth hid her face against his shoulder, overwhelmed by the simple acceptance in his words. They lay in silence for a time, listening to the wind howl. "I should check your bandages," she said eventually, They're fine. Eli? Ruth. He caught her hand. Everything's fine. For the first time in 2 years, everything's fine. She understood. For her, too. The constant ache of loneliness had receded, replaced by this warm, living presence. Tomorrow would bring its troubles, the deputy, the neighbors, the impossibility of their situation. But tonight, they had this. They made love again as the storm reached its peak, slower this time, savoring each moment. Ruth felt wild, free, utterly unlike the dutiful wife she'd been forced to play for so long. When release claimed her, she didn't hold back her cries, letting them mingle with the wind's howling. Later, drowsing in the warm circle of his arms, she felt him press a kiss to her hair. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "Dangerous thoughts." "Tell me." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I'm thinking I could stay, help you run this place." "To hell with running." Ruth's heart clenched. They'd find you eventually. Maybe, or maybe they'd give up. Man could disappear out here if he wanted. Become someone else. Eli Caldwell would disappear, she said slowly. But what about Eli Morrison? His breath caught. Ruth. She turned in his arms to face him. I'm already a scandal. What's one more thing for them to gossip about? You don't know what you're saying. Don't I? She cupped his face between her hands. I'm saying I'm tired of being alone, tired of just surviving. I'm saying maybe it's time to try living again. He searched her eyes in the dim light. The deputy. We'll move on. They always do. She kissed him softly. And if not, we'll face it together. Together, he repeated, testing the word. A slow smile spread across his face. I like the sound of that. They sealed the promise with another kiss, deeper this time, full of newfound hope. Outside, the storm began to break, clouds parting to reveal a scatter of stars, but inside their warm cocoon, two hearts that had thought themselves beyond healing began to believe in the possibility of spring. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the harsh light of reality. Ruth woke to find Eli already awake, watching her with an expression of wonder. No regrets? He asked softly. She stretched against him, feeling deliciously wicked. None, you? Only that I have to let you leave this bed. She laughed, actually laughed, the sound startling them both. How long since she'd felt such simple joy? They rose reluctantly, the spell of the night giving way to day's necessities. But as Ruth dressed, she felt Eli's eyes on her, warm with promise. When he came up behind her to help with her buttons, the ones she could reach perfectly well herself, she leaned back into his embrace. The neighbors will talk, she warned. Let them. He pressed a kiss to the curve of her neck. I'll give them something worth talking about. As if summoned by their defiance. Hoofbeats sounded in the yard. They sprang apart. The ease of the morning shattered. Ruth peered out the window, then relaxed fractionally. It's Tom Garrett again, she said. Persistent bastard. Eli was already reaching for his gun. I'll stay out of sight. No. Ruth turned to face him. Chin lifted. No more hiding. If we're doing this, we're doing it openly. Ruth, get dressed, she said firmly, and come to the kitchen when you're ready. It's time Tom Garrett learned this ranch isn't available, and neither am I. She left before he could protest, moving through the house with new purpose. Whatever came next, she would face it head on. She'd survived Samuel. She'd survived the winter alone, and now, with Eli beside her, she felt ready to survive whatever the world threw at them. The knock came as she was starting coffee. Ruth opened the door with a smile that was all teeth. Morning, Tom. You're out early. His eyes darted past her, trying to see into the house. Mrs. Morrison. I came to check. That is, after the wolves last night. We handled it, she said simply. Lost a couple chickens, but nothing we couldn't manage. We? His eyes sharpened. Right on cue. Eli appeared behind her, fully dressed but making no effort to hide. Morning, he said pleasantly. "You must be the neighbor Ruth mentioned." Tom Garrett's face went through several shades of red. "And you are?" "Eli Morrison," he said easily, sliding an arm around Ruth's waist. "Ruth's husband." The lie fell between them like a dropped glove. Ruth held her breath, but didn't contradict it. Let them think what they would. Legal or not. She'd chosen this man. The rest was just paper. "Husband," Tom repeated, his voice strangled. "But Samuel has been gone near 4 months now," Ruth interrupted. "More than enough mourning for a man who never mourned anyone but himself." Tom's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. "The whole town. Does anyone know?" "They do now," Ruth said sweetly. "Was there something else?" "Tom, my husband and I were about to have breakfast." He backed away from the door as if it might bite him. Helen will want to know." "I'm sure she will," Ruth agreed. "Give her my best. And Tom, that offer on the ranch, consider it declined, permanently." She closed the door on his stammering and turned to find Eli watching her with a mix of admiration and concern. "Ruth Morrison," he said, shaking his head. "What have we done?" "Something foolish, something necessary." She went to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Something real." He held her close, and Ruth felt the last walls around her heart crumble. Whatever storms came next, they would weather them together. And for the first time since she'd come to this harsh land, that felt like enough. That felt like everything. The deputy arrived 3 days later, just as Ruth was bringing in the washing. She saw the dust cloud first, then the lone rider approaching at a steady pace, her hands stilled on the clothesline, wet fabric forgotten. "Eli," she called, keeping her voice level. He emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing the chicken coop, taking in the situation with one glance. Without a word, he moved to stand beside her, close enough to touch but not touching. They'd discussed this, planned for it, but Ruth's heart still hammered against her ribs. The deputy was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sharp eyes and a tin star that caught the afternoon sun. He dismounted smoothly, touching his hat brim. "Afternoon, ma'am. Name's Deputy Marshal Collins, out of Billings." His gaze shifted to Eli, cataloging every detail. "Sir." "Afternoon," Ruth replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "What brings you out our way?" "Looking for a man. Wounded fugitive. Goes by Eli Caldwell. Shot a prominent citizen up in Billings." Collins pulled out a folded paper, shaking it open to reveal a crude sketch that bore enough resemblance to make Ruth's stomach clench. "Tracked him this far before the storms hit. You folks seen anyone matching this description?" Eli stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Ruth and the deputy. "Can't say we have. Been keeping to ourselves mostly. Between the storms and the wolves. Haven't seen another soul in weeks." Collins studied him carefully. "That's so. And you are?" "Eli Morrison. This is my wife, Ruth." "Morrison?" The deputy's eyes narrowed. "Heard that name in town. Wasn't there a Samuel Morrison owned this spread?" "My first husband," Ruth said calmly. "Passed on 4 months ago. Eli and I married recently." "Recently?" Collins rocked back on his heels, hand resting casual-like on his pistol. "How recent would that be?" "Recent enough," Eli said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "You questioning the lady's respectability?" "Not at all. Just trying to get a clear picture." Collins smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "See, funny thing is, nobody in town mentioned Mrs. Morrison remarrying. Matter of fact, they seemed to think she was living out here alone." Ruth stepped forward, placing a hand on Eli's arm. "We married quiet-like, didn't see the need for a big fuss, what with my mourning and all. Pastor Williams from Cedar Ridge performed the ceremony. It was a calculated risk. Pastor Williams had left for Denver 2 weeks prior to visit his ailing sister. With luck, Collins wouldn't have time to verify the story." "I see." Collins folded the sketch, tucking it back in his vest. "Mind if I look around? Man I'm tracking is desperate. Might have sought shelter without asking." "Course not," Ruth said before Eli could object. Check wherever you like. Can I offer you some water? Coffee? Water'd be appreciated, ma'am. She went inside, hands trembling as she pumped water into a cup. Through the window, she watched Collins prowl around the property, peering into the barn, checking the old storm cellar. Eli shadowed him, casual but watchful. When she returned with the water, Collins was examining the ground near the barn. Had some trouble here recent, he observed. Those wolf tracks? Pack came through few nights back. Eli confirmed. Took some chickens before we drove them off. Lot of blood for chickens. Collins straightened, accepting the water from Ruth. Almost looks like something larger bled out here. I shot 2 of them, Ruth said. Eli dragged the carcasses off so they wouldn't attract more predators. You shot them? Collins raised an eyebrow. Not your husband? My wife's a fine shot, Eli said, pride evident in his voice. Better than me with a rifle. Unusual for a woman. Ruth bristled. Unusual doesn't mean impossible. Deputy, out here, a woman learns what she needs to survive. Indeed. Collins drained the water cup, handing it back. Well, I appreciate your time. If you do see anyone matching that sketch, there's a reward. $500. That's considerable money, Eli noted. It is. The man Caldwell shot? Mayor's son. Mayor takes it personal when someone draws on his boy. Collins moved back to his horse. Though between you and me, the boy probably had it coming. Hot-headed fool, always starting trouble. Still, law's the law. He swung up into the saddle, then paused, looking down at them. Funny thing about that sketch, man looks a bit like you, Mr. Morrison, around the eyes. Eli met his gaze steadily. Lots of men have gray eyes. Deputy. True enough. And the Eli Caldwell I'm hunting. He'd have a bullet wound. Fresh one. About here. He gestured to his left side. You wouldn't happen to have any injuries like that, would you? Ruth's breath caught, but Eli just smiled. Can't say I do, though if you'd like me to remove my shirt to prove it, I'd ask you to respect my wife's presence. Collins studied them both for a long moment. Then he touched his hat again. No need. I can see you're respectable folk. Sorry to have troubled you. He turned his horse, then looked back. Oh, one more thing. That Pastor Williams you mentioned, he's still around Cedar Ridge? Last I heard. Ruth lied smoothly. Though he's old, doesn't get out much anymore. Well, good day to you both, and congratulations on your marriage. May it be longer than your first Mrs. Morrison. They stood together, watching him ride away. Only when he disappeared over the ridge did Ruth sag against Eli. He knows, she whispered. Maybe, but knowing and proving are different things. Eli wrapped an arm around her, drawing her close. You did well. That bit about Pastor Williams was inspired. He'll check. When he can't find him, he'll have moved on. Men like him don't linger without evidence. But Eli's expression was troubled. Still, we bought ourselves time. Question is, what do we do with it? They went inside. Ruth's abandoned washing forgotten on the line. She sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. The weight of the lies, the constant vigilance, it was wearing on her. Maybe you should go, she said quietly. While you can, before he comes back. Eli knelt in front of her, taking her hands. Is that what you want? No. The word came out fierce. But what I want and what's smart aren't the same thing. Ruth! He squeezed her hands. I made my choice. I'm not running anymore. Not from the law. Not from this. Whatever comes, we face it together. Even if it means... She couldn't finish the thought. Even then. He pulled her down into his arms, holding her tight. I've been dead for 2 years. Ruth. Just going through the motions. You brought me back to life. That's worth any risk. She clung to him, drawing strength from his solid presence. They stayed like that until the sun began to sink, painting the kitchen in shades of gold and amber. A knock at the door shattered the peace. They sprang apart, fear flooding back. Eli reached for his gun, but Ruth stopped him. If it was Collins, he wouldn't knock, she reasoned. She opened the door to find Lucy Donnell from town, twisting her hands nervously. "Mrs. Morrison? Or, I guess it's still Morrison?" The girl's eyes darted to Eli, visible behind Ruth. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I thought you should know. That deputy, he's been asking questions in town. About you, about your marriage. People are talking." "Let them talk," Ruth said tiredly. "No, you don't understand." Lucy leaned in, lowering her voice. "Tom Garrett's stirring folks up, saying you're harboring a fugitive, saying that you killed your husband and took up with his killer." Ruth's blood ran cold. "That's ridiculous." "Maybe so, but people are listening. The deputy's offering that reward money to anyone with information. And times being what they are." Lucy trailed off meaningfully. "Someone will talk." Eli finished grimly. Lucy nodded. "I'm sorry. You were kind to me. Mrs. Morrison. I wanted to warn you." "Thank you," Ruth said sincerely. "That took courage." The girl colored. "Just be careful, both of you." She hurried away, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Ruth closed the door and leaned against it. "We can't stay." "No," Eli agreed. "We can't." They looked at each other, the weight of decision heavy between them. Everything Ruth had built, had fought for, was here. The ranch, the life she'd carved from Samuel's legacy. But what good was any of it without freedom, without love? "Canada?" she asked. "Or California, Mexico, maybe, somewhere we can start fresh. As Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, or whoever we want to be." He came to her, framing her face with his hands. "I know what I'm asking you to give up." "You're not asking," Ruth interrupted. "I'm choosing. There's a difference." They began to plan, even as Ruth's heart broke a little for the home she'd defended so fiercely. But as Eli outlined roots and possibilities, his eyes bright with hope for their future, she realized home had never been about the place. Home was this man who'd stumbled bleeding into her life and taught her heart to beat again. Everything else was just wood and stone. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow night, after dark. We'll take what we can carry. Leave the rest." He paused. "Unless—" "No unless," Ruth said firmly. "Tomorrow night, we run together." He kissed her then, deep and desperate, and Ruth tasted promise on his lips. Whatever came next, wherever they ended up, they would face it as one. The widow Morrison would disappear, and in her place would be someone new, someone free, someone loved. It was more than enough reason to run. The morning Eli left, frost painted the windows in delicate patterns that seemed to mock the breaking of Ruth's heart. They'd stayed up most of the night, talking in circles about Deputy Collins, about the townspeople's suspicions, about the impossible choice before them. "I can't let you throw away everything you've built for me," Eli had said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I can't let you die for my reputation," she'd countered. In the end, practicality won. Eli would leave at dawn, head north toward the Canadian border. Ruth would stay, weather the storm of gossip, and perhaps, when the heat died down, she could sell the ranch and follow. Now, as pale light crept across the floor, Ruth watched him gather his few belongings, the clothes she'd given him, a bit of food, Samuel's old pistol, which she insisted he take. "The barn," he said suddenly, not looking at her. "There's a loose board in the third stall. I left something." Before she could ask what, he was kissing her goodbye, fierce and desperate, as if he could pour all his promises into that one touch. Then he was gone, slipping out the back door like the ghost he'd soon become in her life. Ruth stood frozen until she heard Buttercup's hooves fade into the distance. Only then did she allow herself to sink into a chair and weep, great, gulping sobs that shook her whole body. When the tears finally stopped, she felt hollowed out, empty as a drum. She forced herself through the motions of a normal day, fed the chickens, milked the cow, started bread that she knew she wouldn't eat. Anything to keep from thinking about the growing distance between her and the only happiness she'd found in years. When she finally went to the barn, It took her 3 tries to find the loose board. Behind it was a folded paper wrapped around something small and hard. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was brief, his handwriting careful. Ruth, if you're reading this, I kept my promise and left. But I need you to know, I'll be back. When the snow melts and the rivers run clear, look for me. I'll wait at the old trading post at Miller's Crossing, first Sunday of each month. If you don't come, I'll understand. But I'll wait anyway. The ring was my mother's. It's yours now. Whatever you decide. All my love. E. The small object was indeed a ring. Simple gold band worn thin with age, but polished bright. Ruth slipped it onto her finger, where it fit perfectly, and pressed her hand to her heart. Days blurred together. The deputy returned twice more, each time with more pointed questions. Ruth met them all with stony silence or carefully vague answers. Yes, her husband had left on business. No, she didn't know when he'd return. The territory was full of men coming and going, wasn't it? Tom Garrett made his own visit, bringing his wife Helen along for propriety's sake. They sat in Ruth's kitchen, drinking her coffee and dripping false concern. Such a shame about your husband having to leave so sudden, Helen said, her eyes bright with malicious curiosity. Business, was it? Cattle business, Ruth replied curtly. Up north. In winter? Tom's voice held doubt. Seems an odd time for cattle dealings. Seemed urgent to him. Ruth refilled their cups with steady hands. I don't question my husband's decisions. Helen and Tom exchanged meaningful looks that made Ruth want to throw the coffee pot at them, but she held her tongue, played the part of the abandoned wife. And eventually they left, trailing whispers and speculation. The worst was the loneliness, after those precious days of companionship, of warmth. The empty house felt like a tomb. Ruth found herself talking to the walls, to the chickens, to Eli's ghost that seemed to linger in every corner. She started writing letters she couldn't send. My dearest E, the house is too quiet. I burned the bread yesterday because I was listening for your footsteps. How quickly you became essential to my days. Beloved. Tom Garrett came by again. I wanted to shoot him, but I suppose that would only confirm their suspicions. Did you make it to Canada? Are you safe? The not knowing is killing me. Eli, I dream of you every night. Sometimes they're sweet dreams. Sometimes I wake crying. The ring never leaves my finger. She kept the letters in the same hiding spot where she'd found his note, adding one each week. A record of her heartbreak. A promise that she hadn't forgotten. Spring came slowly, teasing with warm days followed by late freezes. Ruth threw herself into ranch work, trying to exhaust herself into dreamless sleep. The calving season kept her busy, and she was grateful for the distraction. One afternoon in late March, as she was checking on a newborn calf, she heard horses approaching, multiple horses. Her heart seized, a posse. But it was only Tom Garrett again, this time with 2 other men from town. Their faces were grim. Mrs. Morrison, Tom said without preamble. We need to speak with you about your husband. What about him? Ruth kept her voice level, though her pulse raced. There's been news from up north. A man matching your husband's description was seen in Wyoming, traveling with a woman of questionable reputation. The words hit like a physical blow, but Ruth kept her face blank. I don't believe in gossip. Tom, it's more than gossip. The sheriff in Laramie sent word. They're looking for the same man Deputy Collins was hunting. Seems your husband is quite the wanderer. Ruth lifted her chin. My husband's business is his own. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Ruth? One of the other men, she thought his name was Patterson, spoke up. We're trying to help. A woman alone, taken in by a smooth-talking criminal. No one would blame you for being deceived. The only deception here, Ruth said coldly, is the idea that any of you care about my well-being. You want my land. You've always wanted it. And you'll use any excuse to question my ability to hold it. Tom's face darkened. Now see here. No, you see. Ruth stepped forward, and something in her face made them all step back. "I've buried one husband and survived a winter alone. I've fought wolves and weather and the weight of your judgment. I'm still here, still standing, and I'll be damned if I let a bunch of vultures drive me off my own land with lies and speculation." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving them standing in her yard. Behind her, she heard Tom mutter, "We'll see about that." That night, Ruth sat by the fire with Eli's letter in her lap. The first Sunday of April was 2 weeks away. Miller's Crossing was 3 days' ride. If she pushed hard, could she abandon everything on the hope that he'd be there, that they could truly start over? She thought of the alternative. Years of this, fighting off Tom Garrett and men like him, growing old alone in this house full of ghosts, becoming the bitter widow they all expected her to be. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Ruth began preparing quietly. She sold off some cattle to a buyer from the next county, claiming she needed to reduce the herd for spring, packed only essentials in saddlebags, things that wouldn't be noticed if someone came snooping, made arrangements with the bank in town, withdrawing money bit by bit. The night before she planned to leave, Lucy Donnell appeared at her door again. "They're planning something," the girl said breathlessly. "Tom Garrett and some others. I heard them talking at the saloon. They're going to petition the territorial judge, say you're not fit to hold the land, that you consorted with criminals." Ruth felt strangely calm. "Let them," Lucy blinked. "But your ranch is just land." Ruth smiled sadly. "I've learned there are more important things." Understanding dawned in Lucy's eyes. "You're leaving." "I never said that." "You don't have to." The girl glanced around, then leaned in. "There's a trader comes through Miller's Crossing first Sunday of every month. Native fellow. Very discreet. If someone wanted to send a message north without questions." Ruth's heart leaped. "Lucy, you were kind to me when others weren't." Lucy squeezed her hand. "Good luck, Mrs. Morrison. I hope you find what you're looking for." After she left, Ruth stood in her kitchen, looking around at the life she was about to abandon. It should hurt more, she thought, but all she felt was anticipation. In her chest, hope bloomed like the first flower of spring. She'd leave before dawn, take the back trails Tom Garrett didn't know about. With luck, they wouldn't realize she was gone for days. By then, she'd either be with Eli or, no, she wouldn't think about the alternative. He'd promised to wait, and she chose to believe. After all the broken promises in her life, she'd stake everything on this one. Ruth Morrison had survived too much to stop believing impossibilities now. That night, she wrote one last letter. "My love, by the time you read this, I'll be on my way to you. I'm leaving everything, the ranch, the town, the woman they all thought I was. I'm choosing you, choosing us, choosing whatever future we can build together. Wait for me. All my love. Your Ruth." She tucked it with the others, a record of her journey from widow to woman to whatever came next. Then she banked the fire, barred the door one last time, and prepared to run toward love. The fog rolled in thick that Sunday morning, turning the world into a gray dream. Ruth had been riding since before dawn, pushing Buttercup harder than she liked, but time was everything now. Miller's Crossing lay just ahead. She could smell the smoke from the trading post's chimney. Her heart hammered so loud she was certain it would give her away. 3 months. 3 months since she'd watched Eli ride away, since she'd felt his lips on hers, since she'd known anything but aching loneliness. The trading post emerged from the mist like something from a fairy tale. Rough log walls, crooked chimney, horses tied to the rail outside. Ruth's hands trembled as she dismounted. Was he here? Had he waited? She pushed through the door, blinking in the dim interior. The place smelled of tobacco, leather, and coffee. A handful of men sat at rough tables, but her eyes found only one. He was thinner, his hair longer, a new scar across the back of his left hand. But when he looked up from his coffee, those storm-gray eyes were exactly as she remembered. "Ruth," he breathed, rising so fast his chair toppled backward. She crossed the room in 3 strides and threw herself into his arms. He caught her, lifted her, buried his face in her hair. Neither spoke. There were no words for this moment, this collision of hope and flesh and answered prayers. When he finally set her down, his hands framed her face like she was something precious, something that might vanish if he looked away. "You came," he said wonderingly. "You waited," she replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I would have waited forever." "I know." She pulled him down for a kiss that tasted of coffee and promises and coming home. The other patrons politely ignored them. Frontier courtesy at its finest when they finally broke apart. Eli led her to his table in the corner, never letting go of her hand. "Tell me everything," he demanded. "Are you safe? Did anyone follow you?" "I'm safe. I was careful." She squeezed his fingers. "I left it all behind. Eli, the ranch, everything. I'm free." His eyes darkened with emotion. "Ruth, your home is wherever you are." She lifted their joined hands, showing him how his mother's ring still circled her finger. "I made my choice. No regrets." He kissed her hand, her palm, the inside of her wrist. "I have so much to tell you. I found work up north, legitimate work, ranching, but also breaking horses. The owner, he doesn't care about my past, says every man deserves a fresh start." "Where?" "Alberta, little place called Willow Creek. It's beautiful. Ruth, mountains and meadows, and air so clean it hurts to breathe." His eyes searched hers. "I've been saving every penny. Almost have enough for our own place. Nothing fancy, but it sounds perfect." She interrupted. "When do we leave?" "We?" The hope in his voice nearly broke her heart. "You're sure?" "Eli Caldwell." She gripped his face between her hands. "I rode 3 days through rain and mud to find you. I left behind everything I've ever known. I'm wearing your mother's ring and carrying our future under my heart." "Yes, I'm sure." He blinked. "Carrying our—" Ruth nodded, fresh tears threatening. "I found out a month ago. Part of why I had to come now, before I couldn't ride anymore." The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise after endless night. He pulled her close, laughing and crying at once, his hands splaying protectively over her still flat stomach. "A baby," he marveled. "Our baby. Due in November, near as I can figure. We'll be settled by then. I'll build you the finest cradle in Alberta." He was already planning. That focused intensity she loved so much directed toward their future. "There's a minister in Willow Creek. We can make it proper legal. And the doctor there is good. Delivered plenty of babies. Eli." She stopped his rush of words with a gentle finger to his lips. "We have time. Right now. Just hold me." He did, right there in the trading post, and Ruth felt the last knots of fear and loneliness dissolve. They'd found each other against all odds. Everything else would work itself out. They left Miller's Crossing that afternoon, supplied for the journey north. The trader, who turned out to be the discreet fellow Lucy had mentioned, wished them well, and promised to forget he'd ever seen them. They rode side by side through country that grew wilder and more beautiful with each passing mile. At night, they made camp under stars so bright they seemed touchable. Eli told her about the months alone, the nights he'd doubted she'd come, the work that kept him sane. Ruth shared her own struggles, the letters she'd written but couldn't send, the moment she decided to risk everything. "Do you think they're looking for us?" she asked one evening as they sat by their small fire. "Maybe. But we're different people now." He pulled her close, his hand resting on the slight swell of her belly. "Mr. and Mrs. Ellis Cooper, heading north to start a horse ranch. Simple folk with simple dreams. Ellis and Ruth Cooper." She tested the names. "I like it." My mother's maiden name was Ellis. Seemed fitting, starting fresh with family names. They reached Willow Creek on a glorious May morning when the whole valley was carpeted in wildflowers. The town was small but thriving, full of people who'd come to build something new. The ranch where Eli worked sat in a perfect bowl of land, mountains rising protective on 3 sides, Mr. Jameson, the owner, was a gruff Scotsman with kind eyes. "So, this is the wife you've been pining for," he said, pumping Ruth's hand. "About time, lad. Man works better with a good woman beside him." They married the next Sunday in the little church, with Jameson and his wife as witnesses. Ruth wore a simple dress of blue calico and wildflowers in her hair. Eli had found a proper suit somewhere, and looked so handsome she could barely speak her vows through happy tears. That night, in the small cabin Jameson had given them as a wedding gift. Can't have my best horse trainer sleeping in the barn with a baby on the way. They made love with a tenderness that transcended passion. This wasn't stolen moments shadowed by fear. This was the beginning of forever. Summer passed in a blur of hard work and growing joy. Ruth kept house, planted a garden, learned the rhythms of their new home. Eli worked dawn to dusk, saving every dollar toward their dream. Her belly grew round, the baby quick and strong within her. The other ranch families welcomed them warmly, especially after Ruth helped deliver the Hendersons' baby when the doctor was away. These people didn't care about their past, only their willingness to work and be good neighbors. "It's like we've always been here," Ruth marveled one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Maybe we have," Eli replied, his hand finding hers. Maybe everything else was just the long road home. When the first snows came in October, they had enough saved for a down payment on their own place, 40 acres of good land with water rights and a sturdy cabin. The day they signed the papers, Ruth cried from pure happiness. Their daughter arrived on a crystalline November night when the northern lights danced across the sky. Eli held Ruth's hand through every pain, whispering encouragement and promises. When the baby's cries filled the cabin, they both wept. "What shall we call her?" the midwife asked, placing the tiny bundle in Ruth's arms. Ruth looked at Eli, seeing her whole world reflected in his eyes. "Hope," she said softly. "Hope Elizabeth Cooper." "Perfect," he agreed, touching his daughter's downy head with infinite gentleness. "Just perfect." Later, as Ruth dozed with the baby at her breast and Eli kept watch like a guardian angel, she thought about the journey that had brought them here, the pain, the loss, the impossible choices. All of it led to this moment, this life, this love that had bloomed in winter and flourished in spring. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing their new world in pristine white. But inside their little cabin, warmed by fire and love and the miracle of new life, Ruth had never felt such peace. She'd been a dutiful daughter, an abused wife, a desperate widow. But here in Eli's arms, with their daughter between them and their future stretching bright ahead, she was finally, simply, gloriously herself. Ruth Cooper, beloved wife, devoted mother, free woman. It was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you all for joining me on Ruth and Eli's journey tonight around our Wild West campfire. I'd love to hear where you're listening to this story from. Leave a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just like our star-crossed lovers did. If this tale of love conquering all touched your heart, please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of romance, adventure, and redemption in the American frontier. Share your thoughts about Ruth and Eli's story in the comments. Did you believe they'd find their happily ever after? Until next time, partners, keep the campfire burning and the stories flowing.